Following the French Revolution of 1789 and during the ensuing revolutionary wars, the political map of Europe was redrawn more drastically than ever before. At first, revolutionary France succeeded in extending its borders far to the west and north, and annexing the areas west of the Rhine and Belgium. To protect revolutionary France from its monarchical enemies and to spread its ideals, the French created a network of so-called sister republics. These were satellite states under French protection that adopted the ideals of the revolution: liberté, égalité, and fraternité. Some well-known examples of this are the Cisalpine Republic, the Batavian Republic, the Helvetic Republic, and the Roman Republic. After rising to power, the famous commander Napoleon Bonaparte also continued this policy of forming client states, but he transformed several of these republics into monarchies or even created new kingdoms, often placing members of his family at their head in order to consolidate his rule over Europe. Some examples would be the Kingdom of Holland under his brother Louis Bonaparte, or the Kingdom of Westphalia under his other brother Jérôme. In today's video, however, we will look at a very special Napoleonic vassal state, namely the Duchy of Warsaw, which represented a glimmer of hope for an entire generation of Polish patriots. But just like all the other states created by Napoleon, the Duchy of Warsaw was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it brought a Polish state back onto the map after more than a decade of its disappearance and introduced numerous important reforms and changes, such as equality for its citizens, an efficient administration, and a progressive legal system. On the other hand, the country was little more than the product of Napoleon's imperial power games, and the emperor mercilessly exploited it for his own purposes. In the end, the duchy existed for only a couple of years, and many of its inhabitants paid with their lives in the terrible Russian campaign of 1812. But I don't want to give away too much right now, because in this video we are going to examine this fascinating period in Polish history in which hopes and reality collided so dramatically. In order to understand the Duchy of Warsaw, one must be familiar with the partitions of Poland that were carried out by Austria, Prussia and Russia in the late 18th century. I have already published a 2.5-hour long documentary on the Polish partitions, so I will limit myself to the absolute essentials here. At the beginning of the 18th century, Poland-Lithuania's neighbours, but first and foremost Tsarist Russia, had begun to exert increasing influence on the country's domestic politics. They successfully exploited the unique, albeit highly defective, political system of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, in which the Polish nobility dominated and enjoyed extensive rights. By bribing members of parliament, playing the Polish nobility off against each other, or even intervening militarily in some cases, the surrounding powers ensured that Poland-Lithuania became increasingly incapable of defending itself and was caught in a state of perpetual political deadlock. Attempts at reform, such as those made by King Stanisław August Poniatowski after his coronation in 1763, were met with resistance from some Polish magnates, as well as from the courts in St. Petersburg. Finally, in 1768, Russian diplomats forced the Polish king to sign a treaty that cemented the most damaging aristocratic privileges and granted Russia the right to intervene in the event of a breach of this treaty. Poland-Lithuania was thus officially degraded to a Russian protectorate. In response, some Polish nobles launched a rebellion against the king and Russian hegemony, which quickly spread throughout the country. The conflict then became internationalized when the Ottoman Empire declared war on Russia in support of the rebels. When the Tsarist Empire gained the upper hand in this war, both Prussia and Austria came into play, wanting to prevent Russia from becoming too powerful. In order to reduce tensions between the three empires and to restore the balance of power, Frederick II of Prussia proposed a partition of Poland-Lithuania, which was finally carried out in 1772. As a result, Poland lost almost 30% of its territory to Russia, Prussia and Austria, and had been reduced to a Russian vassal state. However, in the following years, reform-oriented forces, which were significantly influenced by the French Enlightenment, began to gain influence in the country, rallied around the king, and were actually able to implement some reforms, especially in the field of education. When Russia was embroiled in another war against the Ottomans in 1788, the reformers sensed their chance. After lengthy negotiations, on the 3rd of May 1791, the Parliament passed Europe's first written constitution, transforming Poland-Lithuania into a constitutional monarchy with separation of powers and civil rights. The fact that the old political system, which had allowed neighbouring powers to exert such great influence in the country, had finally been swept away, greatly displeased the rulers of Prussia and Russia. When some reactionary Polish magnates instigated a civil war against the constitution, the Russian army marched in and installed the rebels in the government. The constitution and all other reforms were thus abolished. In addition, Poland-Lithuania was once again partitioned between Russia and Prussia, officially to curb the poison of French democratism. A final attempt to prevent the complete dissolution of the small Polish rump state with the help of a broader uprising was launched by Tadeusz Kościuszko in 1794. Although Kościuszko achieved some notable military successes, he ultimately stood no chance against the combined superiority of his opponents. The uprising was crushed by the Prussian and Russian armies, Kościuszko was captured, and the Polish king went into exile. In 1795, the Third Partition was carried out, in which Poland-Lithuania was finally wiped off the map. In a further conference in 1797, Austria, Prussia and Russia agreed to declare Poland extinct under international law. The rather inglorious end of Poland, a kingdom whose roots could be traced back to the Middle Ages, sent many Polish nobles into a state of shock. By far the most painful thing was the fact that the Constitution of 1791 had been so ruthlessly abolished and all other reform attempts had been thwarted. Instead of being free citizens in a parliamentary system with civil liberties, the nobles and wealthy townspeople were now subjects of absolutist monarchs. Kościuszko's uprising and his attempt to extend the designation Pole, which had previously been reserved for the nobility, to all other social classes and to create a Polish national consciousness also remained firmly in people's memories. Even though this longing for the restoration of the Polish state never died out, it must nevertheless be said that most members of the Polish elite quickly came to terms with the new power structures. There was virtually no open resistance to the partitioning powers. Whether out of pragmatism, opportunism, or simply a lack of alternatives, many Polish nobles saw the situation as an opportunity. Quite a few joined the Russian, Austrian or Prussian militaries and quickly rose through the ranks. In Russia, the Tsar relied on cooperation with the local elites in his newly acquired territories and granted them a certain degree of autonomy. As a result, many Poles entered the Russian civil service and worked as government officials. While the situation in the partitioned territories remained calm overall and the Polish question was shelved for the time being, it became an important political issue on the other side of the European continent, namely in Paris. The second and third partitions of Poland took place at a time when revolutionary France had been at war with Austria and Prussia. At that time, France was the only possible Polish ally that could have stood up to the partitioning powers. The French Declaration of November 1792, which promised help to all oppressed peoples, fueled additional hope, even if this was based more on a lack of alternatives rather than on genuine inspiration. In January of 1793, Kościuszko travelled to Paris to ask the French National Convention to support the uprising he was planning. He had a good chance of success, as his role in the American War of Independence and his very egalitarian views had earned him French honorary citizenship the previous year. And while the French did strongly encourage Kościuszko to carry out his uprising, they could not promise him any actual help. And so, ultimately, the Poles were left to their own devices during the Kościuszko uprising, but Paris still looked on with benevolence as the insurgents distracted France's enemies. After the uprising was crushed, many Poles fled to revolutionary Paris, which quickly became an important centre for the Polish national movement. There, two rival political organisations were formed, each claiming to be the true representatives of the Polish nation. The first one was the Agency, founded by Franciszek Bars, a confidant of the exiled Kościuszko. The Agency was liberal in character, based itself on the ideals of the May Constitution, and firmly opposed further Polish attempts at rebellion. The other group, the Deputation, revolved around the priest and writer Franciszek Ksawery-Dmochowski and was more radical in its views. It advocated for the equality of all classes, for the freedom of the peasants, and sought to bring about an armed uprising. However, the brief episode of the Denisko uprising, which broke out in Austrian Bukovina in 1797, shows that an armed uprising was very unlikely to succeed. The leader of this insurrection, Joachim Denisko, supported by the local nobility, attempted to launch an attack on the Austrians, but was quickly defeated, and the Austrian authorities then succeeded in breaking up the conspiracy network. In the following years, the deputation attempted to establish contact with revolutionary groups in Poland, such as the Society of Polish Republicans in Prussian Warsaw, but all plans for an insurrection came to nothing. In contrast, the activities of the agency were more promising. In December of 1796, together with the support from Napoleon Bonaparte, it succeeded in convincing the French Directory to establish a Polish legion under the leadership of General Jan Henryk Dąbrowski. This legion was to be incorporated into the army of the Cisalpine Republic, the French puppet state in northern Italy, but would be allowed to wear its own uniform. The fighters were primarily conscripted peasants who had served in the Austrian army and had been captured by Napoleon's troops. The legionnaires' epaulettes bore the inscription, "Men who are free are brothers," and they were exempt from corporal punishment. The agency's hope was to march into former Polish territories with the help of revolutionary France, liberate them, and reverse the partitions. At the behest of Napoleon Bonaparte, 2 more Polish legions were formed. In Italy in 1798 under Józef Zajączek, and in Germany in 1800 under Karol Kniaziewicz. A total of around 25,000 men served in the Polish legions. Within these military units, the Song of the Polish Legions in Italy was often and enthusiastically sung, a song which we now know better as Poland is Not Yet Lost, and which has served as the Polish national anthem since the 1920s. However, the high hopes that Polish patriots had placed in these legions, and which had been fueled by Napoleon, were not to be fulfilled. Napoleon had no ambition to actually march into Poland with the legions, and kept his plans for the Poles largely to himself. Kościuszko, who came to France in 1798, also knew this. After 2 unpleasant meetings with Napoleon in 1799, who shortly afterwards seized sole power in France with his coup d'etat, Kościuszko wrote to the Polish generals who still looked up to him, "Do not think that Bonaparte will restore Poland. He thinks only of himself. He hates every great nationality, and still more the spirit of independence. He is a tyrant whose only aim is to satisfy his own ambitions. I am sure that he will create nothing durable." In a pamphlet published in 1800, written by Kościuszko's secretary, Józef Pawlikowski, and entitled "Can the Poles Win Their Independence?", it was argued that the Poles could by no means rely on France or any other great power. Instead, the liberation of Poland would have to come from within, and encompass all strata of Polish society. Kościuszko was to be proven right in his disparaging opinion of Napoleon, because the Polish legions were used for anything other than to help liberate the Polish lands. The Polish legions fought mainly in Italy against Russia and Austria, and suffered very heavy losses at the Battle of Trebbia in 1799 and at the Battle of Marengo in 1800. But they also took part in the Battle of Hohenlinden in 1800, which led Austria to sue for peace. The peace treaty concluded in the following year between Napoleon and Emperor Francis II at Lunéville was a bitter disappointment for Polish patriots. The treaty cemented the French annexation of the territories west of the Rhine, and Francis II was forced to recognize the numerous sister republics that had been created in the previous years. France thus became the most powerful state in Europe, but there was no mention of Poland anywhere in the treaty. Since the Polish legionnaires had now served their purpose and had become rather inconvenient, Napoleon sent them to Saint-Domingue in 1802 to suppress the slave uprising against French colonial rule that had been going on there since 1791. The expedition was a disaster. Thousands of its Polish members died of tropical diseases such as yellow fever or in combat, and only a fraction of them were still alive when the expeditionary forces withdrew in 1803. By now, most Polish patriots had given up hope of seeing a reborn Polish state under Napoleon altogether. The status quo that had existed in Central Europe since the last partition of Poland should not be disturbed. The rulers of the great powers were in complete agreement on this. This was evident, for example, in the autumn of 1805, when Prussia hesitated to abandon its neutrality and joined the Third Coalition War against France. From the perspective of the Russian Foreign Minister Adam Jerzy Czartoryski, the ambiguous stance of the Prussian king Frederick William III was a security risk. Therefore, he attempted to convince the Tsar Alexander I to invade Prussia, seize its Polish territories, and forge a Kingdom of Poland in a personal union with Russia. But his idea was promptly dismissed. Alexander rejected this murderous plan against Prussia and instead sought closer relations with Frederick William III shortly afterwards. The Polish question only became relevant again when the Fourth Coalition War broke out in 1806. Napoleon decisively defeated the Prussian armies at Jena and Auerstedt and captured Berlin. Shortly afterwards, French troops entered former Polish territory for the very first time. In Berlin, Napoleon summoned General Dąbrowski and the poet Józef Wybicki, who had also composed the Song of the Polish Legions in Italy, to his quarters. He explained to them that France had never recognized the partitions and that it was now up to the Poles themselves to prove that they were once again worthy to be a nation by providing him with military assistance. However, he did not make any concrete promises at this point. Nevertheless, Wybicki began to spread Napoleon's words and sent emissaries to the cities still held by Prussia in order to incite their inhabitants to revolt. He also announced that the great Kościuszko would take part in this fight for freedom. Unsurprisingly, Wybicki and Dąbrowski were enthusiastically welcomed by the population in liberated Poznań or Posen, as French revolutionary ideals were extremely popular there, especially among the more radical classes, and because the relationship between the Prussian state and its Polish subjects had not been entirely free of conflict anyway. After the capture of Poznań, uprisings against Prussian rule broke out throughout Greater Poland. However, the situation was somewhat different in Warsaw, where a great mistrust against the French emperor prevailed. The more moderately minded aristocrats living there actually saw some great advantages in the modern Prussian administration and education policy and did not want to rush over to France's side. The decision of the skeptics was further reinforced by Kościuszko's blunt refusal to even cooperate with the French. In many respects, Napoleon was playing a double game in Poland. On the one hand, he wanted to win over the Poles, but deliberately targeted the more hesitant aristocracy. He did not want to base his Polish policy on the lower classes, even though they would have been far more sympathetic to him. This was because he desperately needed the support of the old Polish aristocracy, who had dominated over political affairs in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, to assist him in his military campaigns. Any concessions to the lower classes, such as the complete abolition of all aristocratic privileges or the creation of a republican government, would inevitably have turned the Polish elite against him and driven them into the hands of the partitioning powers, i.e. his opponents. Napoleon took a first step towards satisfying the aristocracy by establishing a provisional government commission in Poland. With the exception of Wybicki, all 8 members of the commission, including its president, were members of the nobility. The clearest sign of Napoleon's pro-aristocratic course was the appointment of Prince Józef Poniatowski, the nephew of the last Polish king, instead of the more radical Dąbrowski as director of the War Department and thus head of the newly created Polish army. Although Napoleon had taken a major step towards restoring Polish statehood in 1807 by establishing this provisional government, the Polish question was still far from being settled, and France's opponents would soon have to deal with it as well. Having witnessed Prussia suffer one defeat after another against Napoleon and having received the news of the royal couple fleeing to Königsberg, Alexander I decided at the end of 1806 to assist the Prussians in their war effort. However, Russia's intervention did not change the course of war for the time being. After the Battle of Preußisch Eylau between France and Prussia and Russia in February 1807, which ended in a draw after heavy losses on both sides, Napoleon made Frederick William III an enticing offer. Without informing the Poles, he offered the Prussian king the Polish crown and an alliance with France if he broke his alliance with Russia. However, Tsar Alexander I convinced him to reject this offer. Instead, Russia and Prussia decided to declare the complete restoration of the Prussian state as their ultimate goal in the Treaty of Bartenstein in April of 1807. Until the summer of that year, neither the Prussians nor the Russians were willing to make any concessions to the Poles in their territories. It is therefore not surprising that more and more of the initially skeptical Poles switched to Napoleon's side. After the French had finally achieved a clear victory at the Battle of Friedland in June, Alexander and his advisors decided to agree to an armistice. They were determined to prevent Napoleon from invading the Russian partitioned lands and instigating a Polish rebellion as he had done in Prussia. This led to the iconic peace negotiations at Tilsit, which took place on rafts on the Memel River. Napoleon's primary goals at Tilsit were to win Alexander as an ally against Great Britain and to eliminate Prussia as a military opponent once and for all. But Poland was also an extremely important issue for him in the negotiations. The Tsar, on the other hand, wanted to prevent any Russian territorial concessions and preserve Prussia as a unified entity. After tough negotiations and endless back and forth discussions, an agreement was finally reached. The new Polish state would not be called Poland under any circumstances, but would instead become a duchy with Warsaw as its capital. It should be ruled in a personal union by King Frederick Augustus I of Saxony. On the one hand, this was intended to establish a certain historical continuity, as the Saxons had already been the Polish kings in the 18th century, and Frederick Augustus had actually been designated the next Polish king in the May Constitution of 1791 anyway, which he, however, rejected at the time. On the other hand, Saxony was also an ally of Napoleon and a member of the Confederation of the Rhine. The Duchy of Warsaw initially comprised almost all the territories that Prussia had gained during the second and third partitions of Poland. Only in the east was the area around Białystok ceded to Russia, and Danzig or Gdańsk became a republic in which almost all of the institutions that the city had had before the Prussian takeover were restored. The Vistula River itself was declared a free trade zone to give the Duchy of Warsaw access to the Baltic Sea. The Treaty of Tilsit satisfied both emperors for the time being. Alexander succeeded in preserving Prussia as a state, and the newly created Polish state was a small price he was willing to pay for that. He wrote to his mistress Maria Naryshkina, "At least there will be no Poland, only a ridiculous Duchy of Warsaw." Nevertheless, the Tsar kept a watchful eye on the developments in Warsaw. Napoleon, meanwhile, had gained a military alliance with Russia, which immediately participated in the continental blockade against Great Britain. In addition, he had expanded his sphere of influence far to the east and gained a marching ground for a possible war against Russia in the future. So, as we can clearly see, cold, strategic and military considerations always took precedence for the French emperor, as he personally had never been very interested in the Polish question. The Duchy of Warsaw was to serve his own purposes, not those of the Poles. For the Polish patriots, this new state was a bitter disappointment because compared to the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, it was tiny. Kościuszko condemned the Duchy of Warsaw as an instrument in the hands of a tyrant. Realistically speaking, though, it must also be said that given Napoleon's determination to form an alliance with Russia and his desire not to alienate the Tsar, there was not much more land to be had for the Polish state anyway. On the 22nd of July 1807, Napoleon imposed a constitution on the duchy that had been modelled on the French constitution, which was a bit of a disappointment to those who had hoped for a return of the May constitution. Duke Frederick Augustus, or rather his viceroy, was to rule as an absolute monarch and held full executive power over all 5 ministries in the government. There were 2 parliamentary chambers, an upper chamber with appointed members and a lower chamber with elected members, but both had only a very limited function and in total would only meet 3 times. The judiciary operated according to the Napoleonic Code. Polish was the official language, and the centrally administered duchy was divided into 6 departments: Poznań, Bydgoszcz, Kalisz, Warsaw, Płock and Łomża. However, due to Frederick Augustus's frequent absences, the Council of Ministers had a considerable amount of leeway in the government. But the de facto rulers in Warsaw were Governor-General Louis-Nicolas Davout and the French ambassadors. Nothing could be accomplished without their consent. All in all, the exact distribution of power in the country was not entirely crystal clear, but it certainly favoured the old elites who had already been in charge during the times of the Commonwealth. So there was no question of fair representation of the entire population. But of course, not everything stayed the same. The new constitution imposed by Napoleon brought many positive changes for the Polish lower classes. All citizens were now formally equal before the law, and the hated serfdom was finally abolished. However, the privileges of the nobility were not specifically abolished, and the situation of the peasants remained precarious, as the land, the livestock, and the tools still belonged to the landowners. The peasants were therefore left with the choice of either entering a demanding contract with their landlord and continuing to work for him, thus pretty much remaining his serf, or moving away penniless and seeking their fortune elsewhere. Many of them therefore saw no other option than to join the army. Even though the constitution formally guaranteed freedom of religion, Roman Catholicism nevertheless became the state religion. What's worse is that in 1808, 2 edicts denied full civil rights to Jews, who made up around 7% of the population, on the grounds that they were allegedly not sufficiently assimilated. They lost their right to vote, could no longer hold public offices, or acquire land. But they could regain these privileges by converting to Christianity. Even though Napoleon certainly wanted to portray himself as a benevolent liberator with the Peace of Tilsit and the enactment of the constitution, it quickly became clear to most Poles that the Duchy of Warsaw was primarily there to serve his own interests. In 1808, conscription was introduced, and all men between the ages of 20 and 28 had to serve 6 years in the army. By 1812, the Polish army had grown to 100,000 men and consumed more than 2/3 of the national budget. Some of these troops saw their first action in 1808 in Spain, where they helped capture Madrid. Back home in Poland, farmers who were unfit for military service were mobilized throughout the country to build military infrastructure. For example, 20,000 farmers were mobilized to build a massive fortress in Modlin near Warsaw. But it was not only the military of the Duchy of Warsaw that was mercilessly squeezed dry like a lemon, but also its economy. Large parts of the country were economically unprofitable, and landowners were only able to survive because they had taken out large mortgages with the Prussian state. After his victory over Prussia, Napoleon took over these state debts. Now the Duchy of Warsaw wanted to take over these debts in order to grant the aristocratic landowners payment deferrals and to protect them from seizures or forced sales of estates ordered by the French. Napoleon agreed to this and sold the accumulated debts for 20 million francs in the so-called Bayonne sums. Since the total amount of debt that had been accumulated was more than twice as high, the whole thing sounded like a pretty good deal at first. However, most of the nobles were insolvent anyway, and the payments to France crippled the duchy for a very long time. So essentially, the Duchy of Warsaw had transferred a fortune to Napoleon while getting almost nothing in return. The Bayonne sums had been a scam. On top of that, it was also extremely difficult to generate any further income, as Napoleon had decreed that around 1/5 of the income from the crown estates should be forwarded as untaxed donations to French marshals and beneficiaries. Added to this was the fact that Poland's traditional foreign trade with grain was made extremely difficult by the continental system and numerous other trade restrictions. Thus, the state had no choice but to raise its taxes and impose a huge financial burden on its subjects. When the country then had to host the Grande Armée in the run-up to the Russian campaign of 1812, it was already almost bankrupt. Overall, it must be said that the Duchy of Warsaw enjoyed very little support among its population. The Polish nationalists were disappointed because the country did not bear the name Poland, was much smaller than they had expected, and was clearly a French vassal state. Radical Republicans were disappointed because only 3% of the Poles were allowed to vote due to the property-based suffrage system. For them, it was difficult to stomach that the old Polish elite still had the say in politics. The Senate consisted almost exclusively of nobles, the Chamber of Deputies was dominated by members of the aristocracy, and the Council of Ministers and the Council of State were also made up almost entirely of venerable noblemen. Furthermore, neither freedom of the press nor freedom of expression had been guaranteed by the constitution. The peasants were disappointed because, although they were now formally equal to all other social classes and free, they were still highly dependent on their landlords. On top of that, they disproportionately suffered from the terrible economic situation and the increased taxes that were introduced with it. The Jews suffered under discriminatory laws that denied them numerous rights for no reason and that burdened them with special taxes like on kosher meat. In 1812, the Jews were even forbidden from owning inns and selling alcohol, even though the sale of alcohol has traditionally been one of the most important sources of income for Polish Jews. The clergy were unhappy about the introduction of state marriages and the legalization of divorces. Even the nobles, who dominated political events and whose support Napoleon so desperately wanted to win, did not fully support the duchy. The ruling aristocrats were upset about the constant influence of Davout and the French ambassadors. Strongly conservative contemporaries were determined to reverse the social advances, such as the Napoleonic Code and the formal equality. In their eyes, the supremacy of the nobility was the only correct social order, and they looked strongly towards Russia, where many of the old privileges from the Commonwealth still existed. Together with the radicals, they stubbornly remained in opposition to the state. A popular satirical piece from that time described the duchy as ruled by a German king, a Polish soldier, Prussian money, and the French government, law and code. Only the army, the highly developed civil service, the minor nobility, and the majority of the urban educated middle classes supported Napoleon and his Polish project. In 1809, the military capabilities of the duchy were finally put to the test for the first time, when war broke out between Austria and France. The Habsburgs wanted to occupy the area so that they could use it as a bargaining chip in later peace negotiations. In April, around 25,000 Austrian troops invaded the Duchy of Warsaw, expecting a quick victory. After a brief setback at the Battle of Rasin, the Austrians succeeded in taking Warsaw. But instead of facing the Austrians head-on again, General Poniatowski maneuvered his army into Galicia. In quick succession, the Poles succeeded in taking Lublin, Sandomierz, Zamość, and Lemberg, Lwów, or Lviv. When Russia, as Napoleon's ally, also took up arms against Austria in June, the Tsar did everything in his power to prevent the Poles from achieving any further successes and ensured that there were no clashes between Russian and Austrian troops. So, although the Tsar adhered to his alliance with Napoleon, he did not want to weaken Austria and he tried to prevent the Polish state from growing stronger. The war didn't last very long, as the Austrians requested an armistice in July after their catastrophic defeat at Wagram. In the Treaty of Schönbrunn, the Duchy of Warsaw received Western Galicia, including Kraków, so all the territory that Austria had acquired in the last partition of Poland. As a small bonus, it also received the area around Zamość. As compensation for Alexander's agreement to the enlargement of the duchy, Russia received the area around Tarnopol or Ternopil. The victory of 1809 was of enormous significance. For the first time in more than 100 years, a Polish state had emerged victorious from a conflict with another state and had even managed to gain some territories in the process. In the fever of victory, Polish nationalism reached new heights and the humiliation of the partitions now finally seemed to be overcome. The future simply looked promising. From the remaining partitioned territories of Russia, Prussia and Austria, crowds of people flocked to the duchy in order to join the Polish army under Poniatowski. But ultimately, this euphoria was to be only short-lived, because the next war would be nothing less than a complete tragedy. There were many reasons for why the former allies, Russia and France, went to war with each other in 1812. Even though they repeatedly expressed their deep bond to the outside world, Alexander and Napoleon greatly distrusted each other. This was already evident in 1809, when the Tsar only conducted a token campaign against Austria and actively avoided combat. Alexander also continued to maintain very good relations with the Prussian royal couple. At the end of 1810, Russia finally withdrew from the continental blockade, as it cut the country off from its traditionally important trade with Great Britain and drove it into financial ruin. This also rendered Napoleon's goal of bringing the United Kingdom to its knees economically obsolete. But another important reason for the outbreak of the war was the Polish question. During the meeting in Tilsit, Alexander had only grudgingly accepted the creation of a new Polish state. The existence of the Duchy of Warsaw had created the very first major conflict of interest between Russia and France that could no longer be overcome. Alexander always feared that his Polish subjects might also demand annexation to the new Polish state, forcing him to give up the vast territory that Russia had acquired during the Partitions. In addition, the introduction of the Constitution and the Napoleonic Code had also greatly worried the Tsar. Although the liberation of the peasants and their legal equality in the Duchy of Warsaw were little more than fine words on paper, they nevertheless disturbed the absolutist Alexander, whose population consisted of 95% serfs. In his eyes, a state governed according to French egalitarian principles right on his doorstep could only be a permanent security risk. Tensions rose to a very high level, especially after 1809, with the expansion of the duchy's territory. According to the Russians, the transfer of Western Galicia imposed on Austria was a dangerous precedent that would inevitably lead, piece by piece, to the restoration of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Armand de Caulaincourt, the French ambassador in St. Petersburg, reported, "All the news from Moscow and the provinces confirmed the general upheaval. People would rather take up arms and die, it is said, than tolerate the union of Galicia with the Grand Duchy." The Tsar himself was accused by large sections of the Russian elite of having been too lenient towards Napoleon in the Treaty of Schönbrunn. It was rumoured that his mistress, Maria Naryshkina, a Polish noblewoman, had an enormous influence on him. Caulaincourt wrote, "There is no restraint in the accusations against Tsar Alexander. There is open talk of the possibility of assassinating him. Since my arrival in St. Petersburg, I have never experienced such public agitation." Clearly, there was a huge misunderstanding at the court in St. Petersburg because, as we've seen, Napoleon had never had any intention of restoring Poland, and that's also what he assured Alexander of. The Tsar, however, wanted firm guarantees, which is why he presented the French with a draft. It stipulated that both the words Poland and Polish were to be removed from all official correspondence, that all Polish symbols in the duchy were to be banned, and that Napoleon was to give his assurance that he would use all means necessary to suppress any attempt by the Poles to restore their nation-state by force of arms. Napoleon made it clear to Alexander that he could never agree to such a proposal. After all, for more than a decade, Polish soldiers had been fighting on France's side, and he did not want to alienate the Poles. When the Tsar repeatedly tried to persuade Napoleon to sign this draft, hinting that he would no longer participate in the continental blockade if his demands were not accepted, the emperor lost his temper. Napoleon complained to the Russian ambassador in Paris, Alexander Kurakin, "What does Russia intend by striking such a tone? Does it want war? Why the constant complaints? Why these insulting suspicions? If I had wanted to restore Poland, I would have said so explicitly and not withdrawn my troops from Germany. Is Russia trying to prepare me for its defection? On the day it makes peace with England, I will go to war against Russia." This was the very first time Napoleon had spoken of a possible war against Russia, something which he, up until this point, had always wanted to avoid. The Polish problem continued to trouble the Tsar. He summoned Prince Adam Jerzy Czartoryski, who had devised the murderous plan against Prussia, and informed him that he now wished to implement his scheme to restore a Polish kingdom under Russian rule. He sent Czartoryski to Warsaw to seek support there. However, the Poles deeply distrusted the Tsar, and Józef Poniatowski also rejected the Russian plan. Nevertheless, Alexander did not give up and instructed Czartoryski to continue trying to persuade the Poles to change sides. Meanwhile, he mobilized hundreds of thousands of soldiers on the Russian-Polish border and instructed his Minister of War, Michael Andreas Barclay de Tolly, to make plans for an advance into the Duchy of Warsaw. Napoleon was determined to maintain his alliance with Russia and assured the Tsar that he had no intention of restoring a Polish kingdom. In a conversation with the Emperor, Caulaincourt suggested ceding parts or even all of the duchy to Russia in order to solidify the alliance with Russia and to finally remove the massive bone of contention that was Poland. For Napoleon, this was out of the question. On the one hand, he did not want to tolerate any further Russian advances to the west, and on the other, he did not want to betray the Poles, whose support he so urgently needed. The Emperor was in a terrible predicament. He really did not want war with Russia, but at the same time, he did not want to buy Russia's friendship by endlessly ceding territory. In view of the Russian build-up, the eternal mistrust, Russia's withdrawal from the continental blockade, the danger of Russia moving closer to Britain, and the never-ending Polish issue, Napoleon saw no other option but to march into Russia and impose a lasting peace between the two empires on his own terms. In June 1812, the Grande Armée, including around 100,000 Polish soldiers, crossed the Neman River and marched into the vast Tsarist Empire. Although Napoleon described his Russian campaign to his soldiers as the Second Polish War, he actually had no grand plans for the former Polish and Lithuanian territories he was now entering. Only when it became clear that this would not be a short war, as planned, did he try to give the Poles hope of reunification with the Lithuanian territories. After the French had taken Vilna or Vilnius, Napoleon separated Lithuania from the Russian Empire by decree and established a provisional government commission. The chair was held by Stanisław Sultan, a former defender of the May Constitution, but the whole thing was supervised by Louis-Pierre-Édouard Bignon, the former French ambassador to Warsaw. You see, Napoleon did not want to unite Lithuania with Poland immediately, but rather to present the union as a possibility to the Poles to increase their fighting spirit. When a newly founded Confederate Sejm in Warsaw, led by statesman Adam Kazimierz Czartoryski, announced the restoration of the Kingdom of Poland, Napoleon replied to the parliament, "If your efforts are unanimous, you can begin to hope to compel your enemies to recognize your rights. It is especially upon the unanimity of the population's efforts that you must base your hopes. May Lithuania, Samogitia, Vitebsk, Polotsk, Mogilov, Volhynia, Ukraine and Podolia be imbued with the same spirit as Great Poland, and Providence shall crown the holiness of your cause with success." Once again, Napoleon promised nothing, but left it up to the Poles themselves to strive for the liberation of their country. In doing so, he wanted to keep the Polish question as open as possible in the upcoming peace negotiations with Russia. In September, the Grande Armée reached Moscow, but Alexander still refused to sue for peace. Seeing no other alternative, Napoleon began his notorious long retreat 1 month later. The bitter cold, a lack of supplies, marauding peasants, Cossack ambushes, and several encounters with the Russian army resulted in countless losses. In December, Napoleon abandoned the army and set off for Paris. Of the 100,000 Poles who had entered Russia on Napoleon's side in the summer of 1812, only a quarter were still alive when they came back home in the winter of 1813. In February of 1813, Russian troops occupied Warsaw, which could not be held despite an appeal by the Duke to the city's population. Afterwards, a provisional Supreme Council was established in the city under the leadership of General Wasily Lanskoi. For the next 2 years, Poland was ruled by an occupation regime. One man who wanted to remain loyal to Napoleon until the bitter end was Józef Poniatowski. Instead of surrendering to the Russians, he gathered all available resources and set off for Germany. At the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, Poniatowski stood by the Emperor's side one last time. The Polish army was completely decimated and Poniatowski himself drowned in the White Elster, in what was most likely a suicide. After Napoleon's defeat, the great powers met in Vienna in the autumn of 1814 to discuss the political reorganization of Europe. Naturally, the Polish question also played a very important role in these discussions. Poland itself was not represented, but Adam Jerzy Czartoryski was present as the Tsar's companion, although he had always reconciled Poland's interests with those of Russia. Alexander's ambition to annex the entire territory of the Duchy of Warsaw was met with sympathy by large sections of the Polish elite, but was unacceptable to the other European powers, who feared that this would give Russia way too much power. The Congress also agreed that the Duchy of Warsaw, as a Napoleonic relic, must be eradicated. The restoration of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth within its pre-partition borders, as provocatively suggested by the British delegation during the frequent stalemates in these negotiations, was also unacceptable. Austria, Prussia and Russia wanted to prevent the return of a strong Polish state by any means necessary, and showed extreme solidarity in this regard. In the end, a solution was agreed upon that confirmed the partition of Polish territories, but redrew the borders. The Duchy of Warsaw was officially dissolved, and Prussia received Greater Poland and Kuyavia, as well as Danzig. Kraków became a city-state under the supervision of the three partitioning powers, and the rest went to Russia. The Kingdom of Poland, sometimes also called Congress Poland, was established in the Russian partitioned area, was linked to the Tsar in a personal union, and enjoyed considerable autonomy. All three partitioning powers guaranteed their Polish subjects the preservation of their national rights and created free economic and trade relations between all territories that had belonged to Poland-Lithuania before 1772. The Congress of Vienna has often been decried as the fourth partition of Poland, and in some respects this view is correct. However, the post-war provisions were in many ways favourable to the Poles. Remember, less than 20 years earlier, the state of Poland had been declared extinct under international law, and the partitioning powers had been keen to ensure that no state bearing the name Poland would ever be allowed to exist again. It was therefore a huge step forward that a highly autonomous Kingdom of Poland was now being created within the Russian borders. Overall, most Poles found it easy to accept the provisions of the Congress. The constitution granted to the Kingdom of Poland created a comparatively liberal basic order. Poland had its own government, its own army, independent courts, a free press, Polish as the official language, religious tolerance for all Christian denominations, and personal freedom was guaranteed to the peasants. In Prussia, the Grand Duchy of Posen was created, which was largely self-governing. The district administrator posts were predominantly filled by Poles, and negotiations in the local parliament were conducted in German and in Polish. Even in Austrian Galicia, a provincial parliament was established in 1817, although it did not have as much of a say as in the neighbouring areas. However, it soon became apparent that the partitioning powers did not want to go any further in their commitment to the Poles. As early as 1815, Russia, Prussia and Austria founded the Holy Alliance to jointly prevent the emergence of revolutionary movements. Fearing a supposed revolution, press censorship was unconstitutionally introduced in Congress Poland in 1819. In the same year, Prussia and Austria agreed in the Karlsbad decrees to jointly restrict freedom of the press and assembly. This was intended to prevent critical political discussions and mobilization of the public. So, while the partitioning powers had certainly granted the Poles many freedoms, a possible discussion about a Polish nation-state was evidently too much. Now, how should the Duchy of Warsaw be viewed? In my analysis so far, I have been quite critical and have described it primarily as Napoleon's imperial power project. He mercilessly exploited it militarily and economically, strengthened the political hegemony of the nobility, and failed to create a truly egalitarian society. The lives of the vast majority of people became significantly worse under the Duchy of Warsaw. However, I should also highlight the positive aspects. In many ways, the short period of the duchy was also a time of modernization. Napoleon introduced a modern constitution, an independent judiciary, a progressive legal system, a conscripted army, and an efficient bureaucracy. Compared to the almost hopeless backwardness of the old Commonwealth, these were indeed remarkable advances. Many of these institutions were then also retained under the Kingdom of Poland. On top of that, the new administrative structure enabled the urban bourgeoisie to rise significantly in social status, thus slowly challenging the social dominance of the nobility. But the most important factor was probably the significance of the duchy for the development of Polish national consciousness, which had begun in the late 18th century. After 1 decade of partition, a stable Polish state had finally been created again, with its own army, its own uniforms, its own state symbols, and its own administration. The fact that the duchy also achieved a military victory over Austria, a former partitioning power, in 1809, only further fueled national sentiment. The hope for the rebirth of an independent Polish state was never to be extinguished again after that. Of course, it goes without saying that this national sentiment was initially limited to an extremely small group of nobles and middle-class urban citizens. The vast majority of peasants and craftsmen did not yet see themselves as Poles, but primarily as inhabitants of their village, town, or neighborhood. It was to be a long process before this nation-building effort penetrated and fully reached the Polish lower classes, which is why Poland is often described as a late nation. And indeed, the long-cherished hope for a Polish state was not fulfilled until 1918, when the Second Republic of Poland was created after the First World War. Alright, dankeschön for watching the video until the end. Before I say goodbye, I just wanted to let you know that I do have a Patreon account where you can help me make more videos in the future if you have the means to do so. In exchange, you'll get access to a Patreon exclusive Discord server and, depending on your tier, some other benefits like early access to my videos, for example. In any case, I want to give a special shout out to my biggest supporters, without whom this wouldn't be possible. Marius Gerling, Lieder Titan, Dedeke Flipper, Ich liebe Emden und Groningen, Defender, Tochtli, Azarashi, Lucy Tara I, Rabienka Horatska, A Cup of Tea, Tristan Kriegsmann, Ryan Layton, Celestia, the Grand Duke of Sealand, Luca Drole, Wienweh, Suderizer, Lyle Furphy, Yin, Big Dave, Folling, Turdham Bone, and Johnny No Cash. I'm extremely grateful for your support. Have a very nice day, and see you next time.